Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is September 2022. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with four great friends we are all going to discuss music. And that is Paul Levinson, John Capek, Ira Ingberg, and Clinton Ignatoff. What a pleasure, gentlemen. The first question concerns Walter Pater, a philosopher, said, all art aspires to the condition of the music. Hey, I like that. I think what he's saying is painting, literature, poetry, blah, blah, Zoom sessions, all wish they could be as cool as music, that all art aspires to the condition of music. John, we'll start with you. What is the condition of music? What does that mean to you?
I don't believe it's an aspiration. I think it's a condition of being a human being, where I get much more signal from the cadence of your voice than the content. So all art to me is music, whether it aspires to be or not.
Beautiful. I love that aspiration. Paul, go ahead.
Well, I'll tell you a quick true story. When I was a freshman at City College, God knows how many years ago, I was taking an introduction to music course. And the professor said, "Who can tell me what's music?" I raised my hand and I said, "It's a science." But the professor misheard me and said, "That's a great answer. Music is a silence from the noise of the world." So I always like to say I came up with that because the professor couldn't hear me.
That is beautiful because Thelonious Monk said, silence is the loudest sound in the universe. Okay, Ira.
I thought you were going to say, Paul, I thought you were going to say that your teacher thought it was a seance.
I probably thought that too.
Um, Along those lines of what you just said, Jerry, I studied with a wonderful man named Joseph Valenti. And he was a conductor, composer, Renaissance musician. And I was quite young. I was in my early 20s. And, playing guitar, and the more notes I could play, of course, was going to be the better for the humanity. And he stopped me cold. He said, "You're not playing the rests." I was reading the music he put out, and I had no idea what he was talking about. How do you play nothing? And he went on to instruct me how to play nothing. And the consequence of that is, of course, playing nothing, as you just said, Jerry, is deafening. And I'll drop a quick name. My dear friend Van Dyke Parks calls things the grand pause. And I'm not sure if he spells it Paws or Pause, but at any rate, he engineers that into a lot of his arrangements, and it's breathtakingly effective, and it's not lost on me. But yes, I think music is. It's sort of like what do they say? An idea is the space in between the idea. So it's the same concept.
Yeah. Yeah, it's Bootsy and George Clinton say funk is the absence of. Miles talks about the space between notes. But your nothing line, Ira, was great because your amazingly influential great brother, Elliot Ingberg's on the cover of Frank Zappa's first album. And Frank said many years later, "Nothing is what I want." And he's an Italian Catholic mocking Zen, but I think he really liked Zen. And Van Dyke Parks, all the praise to him too. Beautiful. So, Clinton, you got the question. You want me to repeat it?
When I go out to dance, I just because of who my friends are. Lots of them are into electronic music, and so you go to a rave or something, and with the most danceable sort of rave EDM that I hear, they always build up, and the songs are always written like premised around the drop, where it builds up, na 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 na, and then it goes down, right? And and I've just got this horrible tick that I can't lose every single time that I hear the drop in EDM that everyone's building up to, like the sort of culmination at the very peak when it goes silent for a second, all I can recite to myself is "Oppa Gangnam Style," because it's just the archetypal thing that I end up inserting in every single song after the fact. And for me, that basically means that it's overdone. But right, the quantization, or just the way that dance music is extremely rigorously robotically timed, keeps it predictable. That's what makes it so easy to dance with, is that it's completely predictable. But
Very good.
you know,
Clinton, that was good. And it's like, that's the condition of music. You all summed it up so well. And I think it's beyond that too. But we'll start with Clinton and go back around. Really simple question. Why were humans invented with eyelids and not earlids? Since music is a thing we do consume through our ears, not exclusively. Go ahead, Clinton.
I never thought about it, but what's gonna wake you up? In the middle of the night, there aren't a lot of lights, but if there's a sound, you need to be able to hear it, perhaps.
Very good, Iro. Why were we made with eyelids and not earlids?
Well, I think that I can attribute something to the progress of technology to answer it in part. Being able to see representations of music on a screen, to me, was a culmination of sorts, because I always imagined music visually before I could see it, quantifiable on a Pro Tools screen. And the fact that I would see it from a very earliest age as color. I saw brass as bright yellow, for example, not just because that's the color of the instruments. Drums were always sharp colors, very defined, etc. And I think that the ears have their own eyelids, so to speak, because there are certain things I just don't let in. But the discernment part, I think in some ways the ears and the eyes have caught up with each other. With technology being the handmaiden to that.
Ira, you anticipated my wrap-up line, but I'm going to go to Paul and then John. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, it's a defense mechanism. That is the lack of earlids. And I think that Clinton was sort of getting at it. The world grows dark every night when vision is useless unless you've invented light. And even, fire gives a little bit of light, but really can't be carried a distance. Torches don't work too well. But our ears are our only way of interacting with the environment when it's too dark to see or too dark to see clearly. And in my doctoral dissertation, Human Replay, a theory of the evolution of media, I apply that observation that we can't see at night, but we can hear at night, to explain why radio survived and really did great in the age of television. Whereas, for example, silent movies were all but wiped out when talking motion pictures were introduced. Silent movies, there's no such thing as seeing without hearing. So they didn't replicate or extend any kind of natural mode of communication. But when television pretty much replaced radio for soap operas, political discussions and so on, people want to see who was talking. It never replaced radio as a vehicle of music, which you can listen to regardless of what your eyes are doing. They can be closed. They can be watching the road if you're driving, et cetera, et cetera.
Beautiful. I'm still a radio guy too. John, you're up.
We can hear in the womb. We cannot see in the womb. And it's been suggested that we play Mozart to a pregnant lady, and it has a positive result.
That's beautiful. That's Robin Williams taught me womb service.
I'd like to add one quick thing. I keep a quote in here somewhere. Duke Ellington famously, this is your wheelhouse, Jerry. Duke Ellington said, "Nothing happens in music until after dark."
Oh, nice.
And you know that one, Paul?
Yeah, I had vaguely heard about it years ago, but
Yeah,
I'd forgotten about
and
it.
because I came out of the womb nocturnal, so it works perfectly for me. But it really does explain what I think what we're talking about here, and
Yeah.
that is, and again, my own personal experience was from a youngest age, music always just sounds better at dark,
Yeah.
in the dark.
It does, because during the day there are too many visual things that distract us. The only way we can enjoy music really during the day is to deliberately shut those things out, and then we can get into it.
Yeah, it's like Billy Wilder said, black and white is more true than color. It's like, dude, we live in a color world. What do you mean? And most people go, I agree. But you really touched on what McLuhan said. McLuhan and Duke Ellington hung out. So there you guys, you're pulling all the threads together beautifully. And Marshall talked about sense ratio shifting. So when he wrote Finnegan's Wake, you have to read a book out loud with a group of people. So it becomes you're turning your eye into an ear. So you have to hear the words and look at the words as you're mispronunciating them together as a group. It's like a choral or a hootenanny. But Ray Charles' backup singer flipped it. When he died, she said, Ray Charles turned our ears into our eyes. And so I like this whole thing we got into. But let's go back to the roots of our interest in music. This question is basically recall an early musical memory, when it was approximately, what format, was it live or, cassette or streaming, and it made an impact on you, why? So I'm going to start by saying somehow I started hearing marching band music, John Philip Sousa, Motown, being raised in Michigan. So I had this sensibility of rhythm in drums. And I asked one of my collaborators a few years ago, who's much younger to me, I says, do you know funk? He goes, I don't know what funk is. And he was like, this guy was writing music for movies and he just didn't know. And then I played him some funk music and he goes, oh, I know that. My high school marching band plays Super Freak by Rick James. That's funk, So it was this, big band playing funk. And so this had an impact on me because eventually studying Captain Beefheart, he says, I want to break out of that mama heartbeat. Like that's where our beat might originate from, something about our mother's heartbeat and that rhythm. And, Don Van Fleet, Captain Beefheart wanted to break that. So he invented he didn't invent, he had Drumbo, John French playing this sort of like drunken sailor music beats. It was like a little off kilter, but it had some grooves. And, he was trying to break up that canatonic state, or as Marshall and Ezra Pound said, needle the somnambulism that this rhythm could put us into. So I guess to make it brief, sorry I'm going on, is my sister was a cheerleader in high school and she needed to come up with new beats, like, whatever that cheerleaders need. So she would take an empty can, like an empty soup can, and throw it down the stairs. So the can would go clink, clunk, clink, clunk, clunk. And I said, oh my God, that's the kind of music I like. So it demented my brain. I'll just pipe in lastly, my wonderful wife, Susie Williams, who sung at Carnegie Hall, she learned her music because her mom was Hell Hath No Fury, like a woman scorned, playing torch music around the house. So in essence, mine, it combined the combination of radio, records, and live incident. Hers was really hearing music live. So, John, we'll start with you.
I was born in Prague in Bohemia. I would call myself original Bohemian. And the first music that resonated for me was my mother singing Czech folk songs to me. So the Czech folk songs still resonate to this day because they have a certain quality and that I can hear in the music of Dvořák or Smetana, where they emulated the sound of hunting horns. There's a lot of fourths and fifths. So in a lot of my songs, you'll hear those intervals reproduced. So it had a profound influence on me, and it still does. So I'm returning to the womb again.
Beautiful. So well put, John. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, so I grew up in New York City, and my first and most vivid recollection of music profoundly affecting me was listening to Alan Freed on WINS radio. And the very first thing he played was Buddy Holly and the Crickets, All My Love, All My Kissing, You Don't Know What You've Been a Missing, oh boy. And, I was hooked at that instant. And, one of the things about music, and we can explore this as well, is how different generations often, but not always, love different kinds of music. And my mother had a great love for opera, but she just didn't get rock and roll at all. It seemed like a lot of noise to her, and she always and I actually like opera to some extent. But, I found that interesting, too, because at that moment, my mother I was a little kid, and she said, what are you listening to? And I told her, and she sort of didn't get what was going on there.
Beautiful. Thank you, Paul. Go ahead, Ira.
I think it was a combination of Glenn Miller and Jewish cantorial music. What a combo, huh? I grew up in a very observant Jewish home. I'm first generation. My father was from a place called Poland, Russia. His birth certificate said that. My mother was from England, so she was the moderating influence. But Glenn Miller specifically, String of Pearls, the song A String of Pearls. And I thought about this, not in anticipation of being asked this, but I hadn't heard String of Pearls in quite some time. And about a month ago, I played it. And I would invite all of you to listen. I think it's the best Miller song, period. And despite all of the disparagement that Glenn Miller has received over the years, I think it's some of the best music that ever got made. Yes, it was a somewhat whiteified version of what the black guys were doing. But on the other hand, it was so impeccably done and so perfectly balanced, I think is the best definition. As it turns out, I did a deep dive on that, and one of the horn players on that recording from, I believe it was late 41, early 1942, was a guy named Babe Russin. He was a tenor player. And I got to play with him when I was quite young. And I knew he was a major dude. He was quite old at the time. But I had no idea what he later played with Charlie Parker. He played with all these guys. And I remember I sat next to him playing casuals, playing weddings and society events. And we would talk a little bit. And just like I said, about a month ago, there's Babe Russin's name. He's on String of Pearls. And I thought, well, of course, it makes total sense. The Jewish cantorial music, in a similar way, was, maybe it's DNA stuff, but because of a lot of the minor seconds that we hear in that music, the turns, the end phrases, caught my ear similarly in power as the Glenn Miller stuff did. And the last part I will add, looking at that Victor label, still with Nipper staring at the megaphone, you can't stop. I can't stop looking at that thing after all of these years. It's one of the best logos of all time, I believe. Right?
Beautiful, Ira. That was so for a bunch of McLUHANites. We love that, man. Advertising. Yeah. Okay. That's the advertising is the cave art of the 21st and 20th century. But you know what you said really applies to Nature Boy, one of the greatest songs ever written. You know, Inabe got that from Cantor, and you know it's beautiful. And so, Clinton, you're up.
I grew up listening to what my parents listened to, so it was a lot of oldies from the 50s and 60s, and then my dad's rock music and whatnot. And so I had a record player long after those were obsolete. But what's really formative for me and how I thought about music was when I got a computer and I started downloading MIDI files and started playing around with the technology behind, oh, I can get different instruments to play these different tracks on this digital version of the songs that I already know. And I was like, 11, 12 years old and was basically just doing it to do karaoke in my bedroom for fun, right? But I'd never been able to pull a song apart before and isolate the instruments, even if it is just a cheesy electronic version of an original song that was probably half transcribed by someone who did an okay job, right? But so it's like it sort of changed the way that I listen to music altogether because I mean, I'm sure you could listen to a song 100 times, but without being a musician or having a record studio or a music studio rather, or performing, that ability to pull a song apart, you couldn't play around with that as a kid until computers came along. So it really affected the way that I listen to music and understand it. So not that I'm a very good musician per se, but I think it sort of brings me back to when I went to study music. I took an intro course on the music industry at college, and lots of the kids sitting around there had their laptops, and they're all doing beats for their rap songs that they're writing, or they're doing EDM. And so there's this thing where with young musicians nowadays where they can hyper focus and try to pull songs apart and feel entitled to get inside the internal mix of a song, which is new.
Yeah. Clinton, great, because it really evoked this guy I used to. Oh, go ahead, Paul, in a second. Let me just say, this guy used to stay with me here. I gave him a room and board, and he helped me with some technical things. And he invented Dolby backwards with reel-to-reel magnetic tape machines. He could isolate Jimi Hendrix coughing or the Beatles singing out of tune. So what you were doing digitally, he actually did analog as a fluke because he was just like this tech nerd. Go ahead, Paul. What were you going to add?
Well, I just wanted to say something about what Ira was so perceptively talking about, the Jewish roots of music. Obviously in the Jewish practices, there's a rabbi, but there's also a cantor, and people who know what's going on know that the cantor in many ways is much more important than the rabbi, because it's whatever the rabbi says might be interesting or might not be. But in order for someone to be a cantor, they have to be able to sing in an incredibly attractive, beautiful, melodic way. And therefore, it's no coincidence that the Jazz Singer, which of course is the first talking motion picture, features Al Jolson playing, in effect, a cantor. His mother wants him to be a cantor, maybe even do more, but he's so attracted to jazz, he becomes a jazz singer instead. And that changed the whole course of motion picture history.
Way to go, Paul. And then I'll throw in this one, which will be totally cancel cultured out. Lieber and Stoller, one of them used to live in Venice right here. They're the architects of writing great rock and roll songs. They said when they first came to LA, they sold their first song to a black guy and he screwed him. And they says, how's that? Two white Jews being screwed by a black man in the music business. I'm glad you guys can laugh. But it is funny, you check out, if you haven't checked out Domi and JD Beck. I mean, this woman is the new Art Tatum meets Joe Zawinul, and she plays with a drummer, and they're a duo. Check them out. I'm quite amazed by them. And they got a little write up in the New Yorker last week, and it said, we say who influenced us growing up. They said YouTube algorithm. And I too am operating on that now. It's not the guy at the record store or my DJ. There's a YouTube algorithm that's suggesting things for me to hear. So it is interesting where we're leading. And another guy I worked with a little, and he's making a documentary on Tom Wilson. And some of you know who he is, a black man who produced Frank Zappa, Sun Ra, Simon and Garfunkel, and Bob Dylan. I mean, pretty diverse. And so a lot of you've tackled this question, but it's pretty simple. It's the 3 T's of music: technique, theory, and taste. You can learn what you're playing, how to play it, but how does one acquire taste? John, we'll start with you.
Well, it's kind of an obsession for me because I look at life in terms of degrees of quality, and there's a very hard you can't quantify quality. What constitutes that in architecture or in painting or certainly in music. So I look generally to history. Why do we still listen to Johann Sebastian Bach, 600 or 400 years after the fact? Or why we look at a building by Frank Lloyd Wright and admire, what he did, or paintings by Picasso or paintings by Rembrandt. So I choose to have history guide me as to quality and to some extent, therefore, taste. It may be a subjective way of looking at this, but that's what I look to in terms of what is taste.
I love that word, history. I've been asking that question for several years now, and I rarely get the word history. That was good. Okay, Paul, how does one acquire taste?
Well, to begin with, you either have it or you don't. I mean, I think it can be improved for sure. But look, there are some people who are figuratively tone deaf. They just don't have taste, and there's nothing you can do to give them taste. I think if you have the taste buds for music, to extend that metaphor a little bit, then you are open to learning new things. And, I'll tell you one very, very quick story. The very first time I heard Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which would have been, I guess, June 1968, because I ran out and bought the album. It was
67.
67, right, thank you. As soon as it came out, I really thought that the Beatles had gone off the deep end. There were a couple of things like A Little Help from My Friends that I liked, but there was a lot that just wasn't. And in many ways, these are still my favorite songs. The songs on Rubber Soul and Revolver, they just weren't there on Sgt. Pepper. And I remember telling my friends, I don't know whether it's the Beatles or me, but someone is, going way off their track. And as the days went by, I began to think, you know what? It's not the Beatles. It is me. It's that I just didn't have the ears and the taste to appreciate what was going on in that album. And pretty soon that album became one of my all-time favorite albums, along still with Rubber Soul and Revolver. But I began to enjoy the recordings, which at first I didn't get it all. So I do think you can acquire taste, but you have to have some kind of core to begin with. Plato famously said in the Meno that in order to know something, you have to already know it, because how then would you know that this is knowledge of what it is that you're trying to know? And I think in order to appreciate anything in music, you already have to have some kind of appreciation of it before you encounter that new music.
Beautiful. All right, Ira. Thank you, Paul.
I love the concept of latent taste buds. I agree. I think that I think that you recognize people who have taste. I did at an early age. I was very fortunate to be around people who proved to have what we're defining. I got to work with Tom Wilson as an aside, and he was, if you talk about taste, I mean, the guy was, first of all, he was elegant, always elegantly dressed. He was the only adult in the room when I was around him. Mostly, he produced my brother's 2 albums, Fraternity of Man, and I got to play on the second album. So I worked with him. I was quite young, but seeing how he was a combination of hands-off, hands-on producer, it was about taste. He knew, I think, intuitively, and certainly based on the wide range of the things that he produced, he knew when to trust the artist, and he knew when the artist needed guidance. Intuitively, it seemed. He was dealing with a bunch of lunatics with the Fraternity of Man, and he was able to pull it off. I think when he worked with Bob, it was a lot easier because it was largely, a much smaller group when it was an ensemble, and of course when it was solo, it was just Bob. So, and Bob and I have talked about Tom Wilson a little bit. He had very high regard for Tom, and deservedly so, because I think in terms of taste, when it's coming at you rather than when you're looking at it, when someone displays it in a way for you to be the observer, and you're latent, to use of our newly found concept of latent taste buds. When you get to exercise them, it's really exciting, and I got to do that a number of occasions in my career with people who completely ignited my latent taste buds. So, and Tom Wilson was one of them.
Really well put, Ira. What a great memory. I'm glad you recalled it. So, Clinton, you're up.
Yeah, it's latent taste. So actually, when it makes me think of how IPAs are an acquired taste when it comes to beer. I used to buy them so that I'd be sipping the one gross beer in the bar for an hour and not waste any money. But after a year of that strategy, I just started drinking them faster and faster and faster. Lots of the bands that I like, I could name 3, like the Electric Light Orchestra, or the Canadian band Arcade Fire, or Muse. Right, over the course of years, they changed so differently. Like the albums that I did later sounded nothing like the albums that their early stuff was, and the Beatles, true, especially, right. And so I'm not sure if it's these bands developing into a sound that had a broader appeal. But in general, I'm the sort of person who's always like, oh, I preferred their early work. Like I love Peter Gabriel Genesis, with no disrespect to later Genesis, right? I'm wondering if there's something about these bands when they're still niche and individual and unique, that if you have a taste for something that could become famous, or is on its way to, if you catch that early, if that's some sort of indicator of what taste is, whoever sees the potential there.
Yeah, a really good point. Okay, go ahead, John.
I'd like to add to what I said before regarding taste. And when I've done a lot of teaching, and along with teaching songwriting, I'm ultimately teaching creativity. And one of the things that I do is I put up 3 paintings by Picasso. And one of them is a painting that he did when he was 11 years old. It's essentially a photographic depiction of what he saw, emulating Rembrandt. It's a fabulous looking painting. Just exactly what you see is what he painted. So I call that emulation. The next stage of creativity is to do what Picasso did in later years, where he pulls everything apart, where he was looking at a guitar from the inside. He paints a woman with the eyes over here and the legs over there, and So we're into a stage of deconstruction to break every rule that we possibly can to explore. So we're in the deconstruction phase. And you could parallel the Beatles' trajectory. You know, they started emulating by playing Chuck Berry songs, and then they went on to do the Sgt. Pepper and the White Album and that stuff. And then Picasso, in his later years, could draw a single line drawing of a dove. And the essential simplicity of the line drawing with nothing else but the most beautiful, simplistic, simple, beautiful depiction that he could make to communicate what he was doing. So in a way, it's our ultimate objective to create the ultimate chorus of a song with one word and two notes. So this sort of trajectory is we all utilize different phases. We emulate, we deconstruct, we try our best to create simplicity, and perhaps that's another way to look at what taste is.
It's really
Just a thought.
super point, John. Yeah, I want to take your course. I really love that breakdown because you know it's how Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence and this whole thing where you absorb your influences, then you abandon them. Like, good luck. You know, you're a fucking Stevie Ray Vaughan clone. Give it up, dude. Get over it and do so. You know, forget that. But they can't, you know, and it's how you integrate it. I mean, my two heroes are Preston Sturges and Frank Zappa because they did that. They became their heroes and they did alchemy. They combined two things that are known and come up with a third unknown thing. That's alchemy. Like Frank invented theatrical rock, say, and Preston screwball comedy. But then when they come up with their brand new third thing, they satirize that. So they don't just say, here it is. So, I mean, satire is an important thing. And it leads into this. We'll start with you, Clinton. It's a stupid question. I know it's all about words, but I read it in the Smithsonian magazine, so it's got to be semi legit. What's good? What's more fundamental, language or music? Clinton.
Music. I'm sure babies enjoy music. Just the consonants and the dissonance and the rhythm. It's the patterns of music appear in every level of our senses. The presences and absences, the rhythms. Yeah.
Good. Ira.
Oh, I agree with Clinton. I had an echocardiogram a couple of months back. Everything's fine, so I'm going to be with you guys a little while longer. Yeah, and it's if anybody here's had one, it's very noisy. It's a very noisy event. You're hearing the sound of your heart amplified as they're moving the scope around to try to figure out, you know, where any aberrations may occur. And again, fortunately, there weren't any. And I said to the tech, I said, so that's me. He said, oh yeah, that's you. And I said, couldn't you guys get like some better monitors in here so we could really hear this thing? It was coming out of a little cracker, but like it made an oritone, you know, look like a Genelec or something. But the point is that I heard the music of my heart disembodied, truly disembodied. And I thought, wow, that is really good stuff. You know, it was very, very musical to me. So I think that it's operating, as Clinton said, babies hear it. The other thing I would add is that I have a fascination with old airplanes, World War II planes specifically, because at my earliest age, besides, you know, the stuff I'd mentioned, the sounds I heard first, was hearing these planes. I was a kid in Minneapolis, and for whatever reason, there were a lot of old planes. And I could tell, and I can tell to this day, piston engines. I can't do jets, but I can tell you the engine of one from another. And the one in specific is the Merlin engine, which was used in the Spitfire and the Mustang and the Lancaster and a few other planes, Mosquito. It is one of the best sounding things ever to me. I've gone to air shows and I hear this thing, and it's music. They even call it, the real freaks, the Symphony of the Merlin. It is so musical sounding. So I think the music resides everywhere, and again, as you said, Clinton, babies hear it immediately, way before language.
Yeah, beautiful, Ira. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, first of all, about Ira's heart, maybe that's what Don Henley had in mind when he wrote Heart of the Matter, which is a great song. Well, clearly music precedes language, and some proof of that is the Neanderthal flute. I mean, for all we know, they may have talked 40 or 50,000 years ago, but there's certainly no written evidence at all of any kind of language, where here we have an instrument, and it certainly plays like a flute. The only real question is whether they deliberately poked those holes in it because they knew enough about music, or some wolf bit into it and then the wolf accidentally created the first flute. But either way, it's a very exciting thing to think about. Here, a human being who wasn't even by our anthropological standards fully Homo sapiens sapiens, something a little earlier, was actually creating music. So, and absolutely, babies understand music. I remember, my two grandsons very, very clearly. I mean, as soon as they could walk at all, as soon as they could stand, if you would play music and they liked the music, they began like sort of grooving to the music. And that was way, way before they could say anything.
Yeah, beautiful, Paul. Before we go to you, John, I want to just say I learned from Carolyn Casey about biomimicry, how humans mimic nature. So the guy who invented Velcro got it from a plant. And, Captain Beefheart actually said he whistled before he talked. So did humans hear birds whistling and then they said, well, I can do this and figure it out? Like, that was a great statement, Paul. Did the wolf happen to have some, or did the wind go through it and the human, heard it done by some other thing than humans to invent the flute idea? But John, before we the basic question is, what's more fundamental, music or language? It's sort of a stupid question, so go ahead and answer it. But you being a professor, what's a better way to phrase that question?
Well, my response or reaction is music is language, language is music. They are interchangeable. The funny anecdote is when I watch movies at night, which I do mostly in the evenings, I sing along with the score. I don't look at the movie, I hear the movie.
Nice.
So, sound, language, the language of music, the music of language, it's all the same to me.
Okay, so we'll start with you, John, on this one. And this is Marshall McLuhan saying, song is slowed down speech. The reason cultures have different musical taste is ultimately connected to language difference. Any reflections on that, John?
I would say that American popular music has become so powerful, it's become a universal language. Well, what's interesting is when you talk about song, song was sort of invented as a commercial art form by Stephen Foster, who made the 3-minute song that had a verse and a chorus. We're still kind of there. And there's this trajectory from Stephen Foster, Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, Cole Porter, the Harold Arlen, through to Chuck Berry and the Beatles, whatever. But song has become this universal form that seems to resonate. I once wanted to do an album of my own to find a blues jam band in the strangest countries of the world, to go to like Mongolia, and I'm sure I could find a blues jam band in Mongolia as I could in Siberia, as I could in Japan. and assemble this thing as a kind of a statement of how universal that music and that song form has become. So I think it has become American music has become extraordinarily powerful universally.
Well done, John, because evoked, the tuba throat singers. There's a movie, Genghis Blues, where it sort of shows you the crossover of a San Francisco blues man going to hang out with the Russian tuba throat singers. And then Ry Cooder did it well. He did an album with, I think, an Indian instrumentalist, and they play blues. They cross over. So, Paul, you knew Marshall McLuhan. What in the heck? And you're a songwriter. What do you think Marshall meant? Song is slowed down speech. The reason cultures have different musical taste is ultimately connected to language difference.
Well, first, let me say I'm glad John mentioned the songs of Foster, because I've always loved his songs, and he always struck me as being either the Paul McCartney or the Brian Wilson of his age. He had the same sensibilities, and he also did very different kinds of songs, like Beautiful Dreamer. Really has very little in common with, I think he also did Camptown Races. And so you have a real brilliant talent there. As far as what was Marshall's point, that song was slowed down speech?
That's part of it.
Yeah.
And then the reason cultures have different musical taste is ultimately connected to language difference.
No, I don't agree with that, because I think there's a correlation, but not a cause and effect. And I think that the reason that different cultures have different tastes in music is, and it's more than different cultures, it's even different ethnic groups. For example, Asian music is very different than Western music. And they're both beautiful in very different ways. And I would say there's probably something slightly different in the wiring of the brains of such profoundly different cultures. That's why they have different music, and that in turn also leads to different ways of speaking. And as a matter of fact, in Chinese, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't really speak Chinese, just a little here and there, there's a lot more conveyed by the tone of voice than we do in Western languages. We have a little of that. We can say, yeah, where we actually don't mean yeah, we mean no. That's like a negative thing to say. But the Chinese do that all the time. Just by even subtly changing the tone of their voice, they can say an enormous amount.
Yeah, that's a great McLuhan line. Shut up, he said. Okay, Ira, you're up.
I think it starts with rhythm, really, more than anything. And the cadence of language difference gets reflected. The differences languages rhythmically, I think, get reflected in the comparative music. So, the people who, that there's a joke, musicians joke about the guy needing to get a sub for the Greek wedding, and he needs a drummer, and he says, look, the gig's a piece of cake, just play heavy downbeats on 1, 4, and 16, you'll be fine. So like yeah.
A piece of cake. Yeah, what kind of cake though?
Yeah. So I mean, the fact that this odd metering, for example, we call it odd in mainstream Western music, is very, very normal to these less dominant cultures, and certainly I don't know Greek at all, so I don't know what the correlation is. But there some of the Balkan stuff I know that I've worked with a couple of musicians, and for them, I mean, Don Ellis, if any of you know his work at all. So Don was he had difficulty playing in 4/4 because he was so driven to what we call odd meter. It seemed natural to him. Frank as well, Zappa, was very comfortable in broken up rhythms. he had to learn that because I don't think it came naturally to him, but it felt natural. That's how his brain. Somebody here just mentioned wiring. I think it's rhythmic more than melodic, and I think that the music reflects in some way and maybe it's geographical, maybe it's the climate. I don't know, but I think that I live, Jerry, you and I are in Southern California. I don't know if anybody else is out here, but I've been accused or observed as writing music that sounds Southern California. I don't even know what that means.
Yeah.
Other than, I write music here because this is where I live.
Yeah.
And I don't know what specifically distinguishes what we do here from, say, what someone would be doing in Cincinnati. But I think part of it is language, and we speak maybe a little differently here. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, it's good. And I do want to thank you all. This is a joyous time for me, and I'm learning so much. So, Clinton, you're up.
Yeah, well, McLUHAN had been studying English poetry, and I mean poetry over the course of centuries, for as long as English had been a language. And so the idea of meter and rhythm in poetry, and how a new and fresh meter would become old and stale, and it would take someone like Gerald Manley Hopkins to invent a completely new rhythm. So Hopkins developed a sprung rhythm in poetry, and if you read a poem like The Windover, you're gonna find, to try and read it out loud and find the poetry in it, it's very strange and weird because it's written in a completely strange sense. It's called sprung rhythm, and the words, they go like this and this and this, and it sort of breaks the monotony of the structures that had been inherited, right? So I think he was trying to analogize that to music. I'm not really sure that it worked really well. I mean, you had the British invasion in the 60s, which seems to be something you all grew up with. I sort of grew up with the Japanese invasion through Japanese culture in the 90s, and so I've heard tons of Japanese punk songs, and there's K-pop nowadays. There's lots of people my age and younger, and like John was saying, it's American pop music forms probably have gone global and informed these things, and lots of times Japanese artists will jump into English lyrics halfway through their songs, right? But nevertheless, I think every language is perfectly amenable to a different musical form if you can fit the words into the overall pattern. It seems to me eventually they will grow into something, right?
Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Just quickly, two things on this, poetry versus song lyrics and music. I know a Polish poet and musician. His name is Grzegorz Kwiatowski, and he's part of a group called Trupa Trupa, and they're sort of a neo-punk, beatlesque band, and they do really good music. But he's also a poet. He's written a very profound book about the Holocaust in Poland, called Crops. And he says that when he first started writing poetry and writing music and lyrics, and he was pretty much doing it at the same time, he always took great care to say, well, this was poetry and this was music. And he didn't want the two to overlap or be confused. But he came to realize after a couple of years that why is he doing that? They are both essentially the same. That to him, there's no difference between a poem and a song lyric. Although to the world at large, it might seem that there is a difference. So that was point one. Point two, I just wanted to say to Ira, here's what the California sound is. Little Deuce Coupe, help me, Rhonda. Okay.
Well,
Go ahead.
I mean, well, of course I get that, but I mean, I'm talking about people who have made this observation. I don't write that stuff, but there are things that have been observed. People have critics, whatever, of my stuff. I don't know what it is, and maybe one day we'll find out. I think possibly. I think I told you this, Jerry, when we spoke last time. Somewhat, you have to do these genomes for your work sometimes, which is just asinine at best. What do you sound like? What does your work sound like? And how I have to be the one to describe it. I said, well, It's Peter Gabriel meets Charles Bukowski.
That was great. I remember
Yeah,
that.
so I mean, I want to throw you for a loop. That's how I'll. As it turns out, Bukowski was as quintessential LA as anything ever happened.
Okay, Clinton, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, in a way, more than just the label surf music, does proximity to the ocean have a lot to do with whatever the California sound is?
Yeah.
Just the interface of three elements: the air and the ocean and the sand, and the fact that waves are so prominent just in the
Well, there's an ocean near Paul.
Oh,
yeah.
that's true. So I knew a guy. I was one of my first bands back in the early to mid '60s, and there was a guy by the name of Bruce Smith who sadly passed away just a few weeks ago, actually. But he lived on Long Island, right here in the New York area, right by the water. And this guy, he was also a drummer. He could have been, he could have sat in for Dennis Wilson anytime. He was like 100%, not just because he was able to play Beach Boys songs, but he played the drums the same exact way. So that actually does support Clinton's point.
Yeah, but it goes deeper. It's like marketing and the Philly sound or Motown. But I'm not a fan of Beach Boys, but I would rather say the California sound is Frank Zappa singing "Flower Power Sucks" and making fun of hippies. So I mean, it's deeper enough. But John, you were going to add something. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's another very subtle difference between East Coast, West Coast, is that on the West Coast, drummers play behind the beat, particularly in jazz, and on the East Coast, they play in front of the beat. So perhaps there's a climate influence there. And also the difference between poems and lyrics is something that's fascinated me in my songwriting. So I live here in Nashville and I've lived in California, but all my lyricists are Canadian. And there's something about a Canadian lyric sensibility that I think is climate related. So the guy in New York is playing ahead of the beat, he's cold. And the guy in California, he's warm, so he's cool. Similarly with the lyrics in Canada, it's like so cold. They're stuck in a room. They got nothing to do, so they're going to write much more interesting and esoteric lyrics like a Joni Mitchell or Leonard Cohen or whoever you could choose. So my lyricists come from this cold climate where the poetry and the lyrics kind of come together as some kind of unique quality based on climate.
It's a great observation, John. And that's, this so-called music salon's based on McLUHAN a little. And that's one thing Marshall was. He was one step removed from American culture. So he had like maybe a possible bigger vision or a more comprehensive vision, what he called suspended judgment. But on poetry and lyrics, they asked Bob Dylan, "Are you a poet?" He goes, "No, I'm a trapeze artist."
I think he said he's a song and dance man.
He's a song and dance man too. He said a lot of things. But one thing is, T.S. Eliot said poetry can communicate before it's understood. And I think that's totally, if I listen to Tuba Throat Singers, they're singing about horses, their boots, and snow. To me, it's much more transcendental than that. Go ahead, Clinton. You were going to add something.
John just reminded me that I follow Burton Cummings on Facebook. He's still active and posts lots of stuff. And he was posting some old poetry he had written. And to Paul's point earlier, he had written some poetry, and all the comments were, "Oh, this is wonderful. When are you going to write a melody for it?" And I guess Mr. Cummings is still of the mind that no, I don't need to write a melody for it. This is poetry. It's complete as it is. So I'm wondering if we're comparing poetry to lyrics, or poetry to a song as a whole, where the music is in the lyrics. I wonder if there's a difference there.
Well, there is difference, but go ahead, Paul.
I just want to say one thing about how music can move people regardless of the words. So here's a confession. I always liked, and still do, like the Russian national anthem, much more than the American national anthem or just about any other national anthem. It's just very profound, moving music. And I especially hate to say that now, given what Russia is doing. But there you have an example of the profundity of music getting to you in a way that makes the lyrics irrelevant. Because if you listen to the lyrics of that song, it's nothing that first of all, it's not all that profound, and when it's associated with some kind of totalitarian regime, it becomes outrightly disturbing. But the music is still nonetheless very effective.
Yeah. It's really good. So let's go into attention a little. I've asked you guys all this question before, but I found it interesting. If you haven't read the R. Crumb article in the New York Times this past Sunday, it's an amazing article. And his wife basically says, no artist who's honest knows why he does something. That's very romantic, because the other end of the spectrum, you've got Samuel Johnson saying, no man but a blockhead ever wrote except for money. Which, hey, it's not bad that you can sit in your room and write a song and get paid for it. And, you can do something you love to do and not treat it like, a job. Like you get your job and your life as mixed up as possible, as I try to tell people. But Harry Smith, who probably spawned Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, and everybody by bootlegging hillbilly music, and he did a lot more than that too. He said the great line, I saw America changed through music. So then he's an amazing pioneer. If you don't know about Harry Smith, look him up. So they asked Bob Dylan in the latest issue of ARP magazine, or whatever. What is it, ARP? Yeah, our AARP magazine. The Jan, the Rolling Stones guy's book. He asked Bob Dylan, do you think you played any role in the change of popular music in the last 4 years, early in his career? And Bob Dylan says, I hope not. So we know Dylan's a smart ass, and he's a great thinker and an amazing musician and the songwriter. But we'll start with you, John. A screenwriting teacher told me great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Stanley Kubrick says the opposite. Great art, great music is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play when you're writing a song?
I must be a blockhead because what I teach when I was at Berkeley School of Music, and in my first lecture there, I had a room full of students with like pads and papers trying to get the secrets of commercial popular songwriting. All the faculty that were there, and I'm set up with a sequencing setup, and they say, well, when I go into the studio in the morning and set up kind of my paper and my pencils, and I have this thing in front of me. It's 88 buttons, some of them black, some of them white. And my mindset is to absolutely have no fucking idea what I'm doing. I don't want to know. I want to have the zen of emptiness and have the universe, inform me as to what the zeitgeist is and how I can express that through these 88 buttons that are in front of me. So I don't want to know. And for you guys who have a pencil and paper wanting the 10 secrets to commercial pop songwriting, throw it away. You need to clear, to be open, in order to go to the next step. And if you don't, certainly you have to have some skills to utilize a palette and a paintbrush or whatever, but I don't want to know. I don't want to know anything.
It's beautiful, John. I know I want to ask you, how do you accomplish that? Zen is a great word, but I have to add, my friend Dylan Buston's a great Thoreau and Emerson scholar, and he writes beautiful songs, maritime folk singing, and all this great music. his song was performed on Garrison Keillor's radio show by two young women. And Garrison goes, "Who wrote that?" And they goes, "That's an old traditional Appalachian folk song." And I said, "Dylan, were you pissed that they didn't say you wrote it? Because he wrote the song." He goes, "No." And I goes, "You mean, don't you want to own your publishing and be able to send your son to college by the publishing?" No. And then I was going through Dylan's bookshelf one day, and there was a song by Tommy Boyce, says "How to Write a Hit Song." So I know what you're saying, but John, let's do the part B of this. What about people who believe that a song can do what Harry Smith said? I saw America change through music. I mean, Dylan helped the anti-war movement with Masters of War. He always go, "Don't blame me." He's just sort of sidestepping. It was an anthem and probably affected a lot of kids becoming, aware of pacifism.
Yeah,
So,
but it doesn't come through intention. It comes through reflection. You reflect the zeitgeist. So you have to empty your brain to invite the zeitgeist to come in. If you follow the 10 rules of songwriting, you're not going to go to that place, with that intention. It's not going to be any good. All artists reflect. We reflect what we see through our own kind of, our own personality.
wait, could I write that down as rule number 1? That was pretty dang articulate, John. Okay, Paul, you're up.
Well, first of all, just so you know, when I write a novel or a short story, I almost never have any idea, not only about where it's going to end, but even how it's going to get there. I just sit down, I start writing, I write a paragraph. If it works, I go to another paragraph, and I literally make it up as I go along. And I really shouldn't admit this, but from time to time, a publisher wants to see an outline of what you're going to write if you're asking for a big advance for a new novel. And basically, I can do an outline, but then I proceed never to follow it when I actually write. And I realized a long time ago that that's actually the way I also write songs. And I assume that's the way most people write songs, right? You don't know when you're writing a lyric what the last lines are going to be. It just develops as it goes along. So I think that that's an important thing as far as intention is concerned. I think a lot of people retroactively say they had a certain intention when they wrote this or that, and that's just public relations. It's not actually a true report. And on that point, let me mention I.A. Richards, a British literary critic, wrote a whole bunch of books in the 1920s, and he said, and this is pretty shocking, never ask an author what he or she intended, because it has nothing to do with what the book is actually about. First of all, the author might not tell the truth. Second of all, Freud was very much in the air then. Maybe the author is unaware of some unconscious things that went into the story. And in general, don't bother to ask them. So, people have driven themselves crazy. What did that ending of The Sopranos mean? When it just suddenly cut to black. Did that mean Tony was killed, or did Tony survive? And it's a ridiculous question. I mean, you can come to your own conclusion, but don't ask what the creators of the show intended, because they may not have intended anything, or they may be lying about what they intended.
That's what I specialize in, ridiculous questions and lying. So thank you. But I.A. Richards, I'm glad you brought him up, because that's the guy who, when Marshall studied in Cambridge with Leavy's and I.A. Richards, they turned him on to Finnegan's Wake in 1939. And that's what changed the whole world. As smart-assy Brian Eno, who's a very intellectual kind of guy, we should have him here today. He said, McLUHAN changed the world with one sentence. Yeah, so they could resell his book. Okay, Ira, you're up.
I think for me, intention is pretty simple. I'm either under duress to do it, or I'm under some inclination to write. Duress is wrong, but okay, we're getting together, we're going to pair up, or if it's on my own. But then for me, it's always about discovery. and discovery leads to more fuel for the continuation of the process. And somewhere along the line, and most of my stuff are songs with lyrics, you start to I start to ask myself, well, what's this song about? And that's the hard part, because I may have some very, I thought, clever lines that I keep a notepad. It's right here at all times. It's a legal pad with lines I love. Unrelated, stolen sometimes. Sometimes I'll wake up. I keep a Post-it by my bed, so I'll come up with lines. But and every once in a while, I get to use one. I thought, oh, that's great. I get to cross it off and recopy it. But I ask myself the question of what's this thing about? And it's very difficult to answer oftentimes, and especially connecting disparate parts. The chorus is working great. The verse is working great, but boy, they're not even related. What is that link? And through intention, through just sweat equity, I'll find that life raft that gets me out, out of the churning water. And I was successfully, I would announce to my wife, guess what happened? I figured out how this thing works. Because I'm as much an observer as I am a creator, oftentimes more of an observer. And I think that, again, I think we talked about this, Jerry. When I made my first solo album, I'd been working with other people for a long time, but I never made my own record. And I was not able to, up to the point that I made that first record, to be dispassionate about my own work, and to be able to look at, listen to the guy singing, who happened to be me, but I'm hearing it coming over the speakers. It happens to be me, but could be anybody. And be very removed from it. I'm the producer now. Well, that was good. Good. No, sing that one again. Go down the line of things, if it's a guitar part, whatever it is. But I think it's all about, for me, again, the discovery is the fuel that keeps me engaged and keeps me honest, I think, creatively. So that at the end of it, and I've said this to many people over the years, I have no idea how I did it. Not a clue. I couldn't do 10. Here's the 10 ways I wrote my song. Couldn't tell you the first one. Yeah, I started out with a drum loop, or I started out with a guitar figure, or I heard a melody. That's it. After that, everything is moment to moment discoveries.
Really well put, Ira. Thank you. Because the missing link is the Shags, as Frank said. They're the missing link between Captain Beefheart and the Beatles.
Yeah.
So, Clinton, you can apply this if you don't want to as a songwriter. As now, Clinton's
I should sell myself short.
Okay, go ahead.
I've written a few songs.
Good.
Largely part of this college course I was talking about, and one of my favorites. I wrote 90% of the lyrics in the span of about 2 hours to this basic Pachelbel monotonous thing that I had to do as a project. And I remember I was just trying to be as clever as possible with as many in-jokes and references as possible. So I know, shore to ship, this is no time to dip, get a grip. I'm making something light to throw you out from the digital blue. Till then you'll be safe in the belly of my wailing tune. And then the guitar lifts up, right? Don't pay me till I ferry you home. You won't be sailing alone, guided by the light of the stars and the moon and my 37 flares for you, etc., etc. So it's like you got two Krista Berg references from the Getaway, shore to ship instead of ship to shore, and then don't pay me till I've ferried you home, right? And then you've got this 37 flares thing, which is from the movie Office Space, where Jennifer Aniston is getting berated from her boss in the restaurant. It's like, you're not wearing enough flair. Joe over here is wearing 37 pieces of flair, right? And just this ridiculous feeling of having to dress yourself up for right. So it's like I was just playing along at the line by line joke reference, and then I had to sing the song in class, and there's a pelvic thrust like 2/3 of the way through, and I can attest that it really does drive them insane when they're not expecting it. Right, and then you get used to it, and a few months later, it's like, wait a minute, like there's something deeper in the whole song that I had no intention to write into it, that I became sort of like weirded out, but like how you like there's meaning that you subconsciously insert at higher levels that you weren't aware of when you were creating it, and it really bugged me out at the time. And I think that does speak to the power of music, which is in one part inspired, but another part methodical and with intention, when it sort of comes together at multiple levels, right?
It's really good, Clinton. Yeah, words evoke more in their meaning. So, gentlemen, this has been highly enlightening. I want to do a tetrad.
Quick.
Go ahead, Ira. Go ahead.
Am I allowed to do a response to a little what Clinton said about?
Oh, of course. Yes, please.
I saw that movie relatively late in life. I didn't see it when it came out. I saw it, I think 5 years ago, something.
Oh, yeah.
And it's from the late 90s, right?
Yeah.
98, 90. And I had no idea. People say, oh, you have to see this movie. Has everybody here seen Office Space? Oh, you must see it, please.
It's Mike Judge, the guy who does King of the Hill.
Yeah, it's really, really something. But my experience with it was, I didn't know when it was made. And so we're watching it, and I kept thinking, boy, Jennifer Aniston, she really looks good. I mean, wow, what is she eating? And aside from the computer monitors were a little large and the cell phones were a little large, not much really changed. It didn't look like they tried to create a period piece. And this is my point to this. They didn't have to, because not that much has outwardly changed in our world. Musically, fashion, go down the list. And so that movie now is, and I don't know if it now 6-7 years later, if I would still have that experience. Maybe it's now going to show more age, but throughout, you take a period of time. Take a look at let's throw some film history. Sunset Boulevard, 1950, I think it was.
Yeah.
Okay, so look at that, and then look at a movie from 1962. Take your pick. Manchurian Candidate comes to mind. Completely different. I mean, you knew right away the music everything was different. Yeah. And go down the line with whatever the cultural the monocultural aspects were that Office Space was near the end of. That Office Space was I would call it a monoculture movie, in that it was part of that time where we went to movies to see, well, certainly pre-pandemic. But it really raised this whole issue for me about what I call the balkanization of culture, and how stuff just completely broke apart. I don't know, 5 years, whatever, 10, take your pick, somewhere in there, where we knew, those of us who are older than you, Clinton, to differentiate, use the Beatles again, the cliched. The Beatles in 1965 sounded nothing like the Beatles in 1968. It was light years in those 3 years. 70s stuff, you could look at, pick another musical act. I don't know. Doesn't matter. Point being is that stuff was changing so quickly and so dramatically. And then there's this outward lack of change from early 2010s onward. Inward, I mean, certainly internet stuff, other stuff, dramatic changes, but physical changes, hairstyles, clothing, nothing's changed. That's my rant. That's
beautiful.
My rant.
You evoke so much great stuff, because the first one is David Lee Roth. Here today, gone later today.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, but we should do another salon someday just on time in music. Time is such a factor that we don't really consider. But why don't we can sort of close out with this tetrad on melody. So you brought up, Ira, a great word, discovery. And this is when humans invent something or discover it, it has unintended consequences. It's like things that shape our behavior. So, the car was intended for various reasons, but it did other things that we didn't, a lot of us had sex in a car, or I used the car as a radio on wheels. This wasn't really what it was intended for. So that's what we're doing with the tetrad, the 4 questions Marshall sort of came up with by studying Vico and James Joyce. So we're going to take the thing melody. So we have to assume right away it's something that humans invented. So it's even debatable if we invented melody, but we invented the word melody. So we all know what melody is pretty much. We know sort of why it was invented or what's its main use and function is. But let's sort of, in the obvious is fine, but go like deep sea diving and say, how did it shape our behavior? So, John, we'll start with you. Melody. What does melody enhance or intensify?
Melody I see is a reflection of speech. So when I have a lyric and I want to create a melody, I will intensify, the speech and the cadence of speech. What does melody da 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 da? As you asked the question, but what it has intensified to me is a reflection of, you were talking about time. We are in what I see as a dark age, a melodic dark age, where harmony and melody have, we're in that sort of deconstruction period of the 3 elements of creativity, where we emulate and then we deconstruct and then we create, something new. We're in a dark age of melody where it's almost like a criminal offense to have a memorable, likable, real, universal, anthemic melody. We're still listening to the great American songbooks to hope that we still have some connection to a melody that means something. So I see what has happened as a result of this resistance against anthemic melody is a reflection, a negative reflection. I see us in a dark age that totally reflects, what is happening currently in the world.
Anthemic. I love that word, and that was really well done. Paul, what does melody enhance or intensify?
It enhances being connected to something. And it could be imagination. You're connected to something that's not right in front of you. Or it could just be hugging someone who's right in front of you. But in all of those cases, connectivity is something that melody enhances or intensifies. It makes, the whole thing about, artists are the antennae of our species. Music makes us all antennae of our species.
Really well put, Paul. Thank you. Ira.
Well, I don't think I can add much to what Paul and John said, other than, and I say this to people who sometimes, if I'm in collaboration, we're stuck for lyric, something's not coming. I said, just start la la, just put, and we have the technology, certainly, put it on a loop, just loop the verse, and you will find the sound of words happen. And I know that, all of the greats say the same thing. Yeah, I just, what McCartney had, what scrambled eggs was yesterday, classic example. But I think that what happens is it intensifies, to answer the question, it intensifies that intentionality, I believe.
Yeah.
It intensifies the intention. How about that for Caroline Casey? She loved that one, right?
I love that. Okay.
Caroline Casey's my favorite. I listen to her all the time too. The word conspire, you ever heard her break that one down?
Please tell us.
To breathe together.
It's it.
Conspire, breathe together. So what it intensifies, if you look at a blank lyric, not a blank, if you look at lyrics on a page, this is a good example. Before you hear the song, And then you hear the song, if it's well done, John, if it's a melody that has maybe even a hint of anthemic or something, some Stevie Winwood just singing something that makes my heart break, that intensification is automatic. You're looking at these words, which may or not look terribly impressive on a page. They could be nonsense, and many times they are. But then when they're sung, all that nonsense becomes consense. The dissonance becomes consonance. And how does that happen? Because of what melody does.
Yeah.
I think it hits us at a very, very cellular level that we can't even articulate.
Yeah, it's a great line, Ira, so well put, because it's the great, Louis sort of invented scat singing, let's sort of say. But my favorite is when Fontella Bass is singing Rescue Me, and at the end, she drops her lyric sheet and she goes, uh-huh. And I was like, that's my lifeblood. And I didn't need to know that, but even knowing it, it was like, what? Yeah. She didn't sing that on purpose, and she did, and it just flew. It was organic. So, Clinton, you're up. But gentlemen, we were trying to do 90. I hope everybody can stay a little longer in order to get this tetrad. Keep your answers down to 3 to 5 words, kind of literally. But Clinton, you're up. What does melody enhance or intensify?
Melody demands accompaniment. I mean, when you hear a melody, you want to harmonize with it, or you want to do some sort of counterpoint, or you want to dance. You can have one melody covered in many different genres, and what's brought in is all the background, the ground of it, right? Melody is the figure, and then everything that rushes to meet it like a magnet from the peripheries that's inspired out of everyone who has their piece in relation to the melody. That's melodies then enhances the ground or the accompaniment or something like this.
That's really good, because that's Gestalt therapy, Fritz Perls, where Marshall got a lot of the sensibility of the tetrad, the figure in the ground. And it's really what the environment, when we invented melody, what we're doing is not on the word melody or what melody is. We're sort of psychoanalyzing the hidden psychic effects of the environment that was created when humans invented melody. And I was going to say it enhances written notes. So the second question, John, you're up. What does melody render obsolete or displace? And you sort of throw time out the window. Horse and buggy still exist. You say, well, what does a car render obsolete? The horse and buggy. Well, there's still horse and buggy, so it's not absolute. So it's sort of, this is a poetic exercise, by the way. We're not being too literal. It's sort of, as Eric McLUHAN put out in a book about tetrads, it's sort of like hieroglyphics meets poetry. So, John, you're up. What does melody render obsolete or displace?
Melody displaces words because melody lingers where words are long gone.
Perfect. Go ahead, Paul.
Melody obsolesces a big, heavy, amorphous rock or stone that's right in front of us. And we can't kick it away. We can't get around it. Melody does that job for us.
Icarus rules. Okay, Ira.
Expanding on John, melody renders meaning less important.
Wow, you guys are amazing. Good. I always want to do tetrads like College Bowl. Like we could kick ass. We have this team. Okay, Clinton, what does melody render obsolete?
I want to say something like the monotony of droning. You can sustain a note, but then you go somewhere else right afterwards. Thank goodness.
You mean the mandatory Philip Glass soundtrack on every documentary from now till the end of time? I got to tell you one anecdote. My friend who lives 3 blocks from here, he produced, it's not quite Philip Glass's first film, but it's almost Thin Blue Line. And it's in Errol Morris says, I want Philip Glass soundtrack. And Philip wasn't known then. He goes, that's horrible. Don't do that. And he says it's the only regret he ever had, telling a guy not to use Philip Glass.
Very, very quickly, I will say in defense of him, I was not a fan of Philip Glass's.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone here is, but I had to do a score some years ago that they attempt with Philip Glass. Like, well, we can't get it. You got to do something like his. And to the casual ear, he does sound very redundant. He sounds, and in fact, he's not at all.
Oh no, I agree 100%.
I still don't really like him, but boy, do I admire his ethic. He's
my friend who came here to write music soundtracks. That's his godhead, and Hans Zimmer, and he, I'm fine with it. I just like to mock things sometimes, but I know he's talented. And then he reads Philip Glass's book, and he said Philip Glass admitted he got everything he knew by going to the Garrick Theater Mothers of Invention shows. It's like, oh no.
Another one, yeah.
Okay, John, you're up. This question is, what does melody retrieve? What does it bring back that we got rid of? So it sounds a little contradictory, but it's basically, what does it retrieve?
Melody is an abstract form. It's not that definable. Certainly, if you go into different cultures, but if we're just restricted to Western melody, where we have the 12 note scale, where we have the ability to create something from 12 notes, it brings back like emotion, human feeling, human emotion that we often didn't know was there. I mean, I can hear a Czech melody that will make me cry simply from the melody. If you watch the funeral of Queen Elizabeth and some of the melodies that were accompanying the Long March were deeply affecting emotional melodies. So that made people cry. So it's a deep thing.
It's an amazing thing how any of us can hear a song and a tear will come. It is like truly great. Okay, Paul, what does melody retrieve?
Well, actually, even before John just said the wise thing that he said, I was going to say that melody retrieves crying. And that's what babies do. That's what adults sometimes do. And that's what Roy Orbison sang so beautifully about with this, angelic voice of his.
Yeah, I'll dedicate this to my mom, Dolores, who taught me every little breeze used to whisper Louise. Just loved that song and heard sang, and she taught me that crying. Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you. For Dolores Vielka, she said, when you cry, you're not only getting emotionally release, but you're also getting toxins out of your body through the tears. Okay, Ira, what does the melody retrieve?
Memory.
Oh my God, you guys are masters. Okay, Clinton, what does memory retrieve?
What does melody?
No,
retrieve?
no, I see. I flubbed. I'm glad you're paying attention. What does melody retrieve?
Yeah, it exists. Like John made me think, a melody is generally played in a scale, so it retrieves the rest of the scale, or maybe it retrieves like scales altogether, because the melody implicitly has the whole scale in it, even though it's only playing it note by note, right? Just this sense of proportion between the frequencies or something.
It's amazing, really beautiful. It's like Finnegan's Wake. You don't have to read 628 pages of gobbledygook. You can just read one word, Laughtears. That's it. That's the DNA for the whole book. You can say, hey, I read the whole book. So yeah, that's that within fractal kind of meme kind of thinking. Okay, John, the last question of the tetrad is, what does melody become? What could it become when pressed to an extreme? It's like the reversal or the flip.
again, I have to generalize my response. I feel like all creativity is dealing with tension and release. So, what within those 12 notes, if we're again talking about Western music, the degree of tension and release that our melodic story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's once upon a time, a bunch of shit happens, and then we lived happily ever after. A bunch of shit that happens in the middle is all the tension that we can build for the resolution at the end. And I don't believe we have exhausted all possibilities, even though there's only 12 tones. There's still a lot to be discovered that can have amazingly deep emotional response. And rules are changing as to what is acceptable as cultures change within those 12 notes. So I'm really interested to see what exploration there is still to be made from those 12 notes.
Isn't it cool to think, I'm having this Jean-Luc Godard who said, I believe in beginnings, middles, and ends, but not necessarily in that order. And I was trying to figure out the name because everybody thinks he's a great filmmaker and he talks about film great, but they want to complain. They go, I don't want to get on your Zoom and complain. And so I found the word in our Crumb article, what's next? That's the two words, like what's next? He's died. So what? What's next? Okay, Paul, if you take melody, press it to an extreme, what might it flip into?
Well, if we are considering melody as purely music, then it reverses into full-fledged songs, music with lyrics. So classical music, which had no lyrics, reverses into Stephen Foster, Cole Porter, Bob Dylan, Paul McCartney.
Cool. That's good. Ira.
It becomes history.
Whoa, what a word. Well, we got to give a shout to Sun Ra. He says it's not it's his story. It's not my story. And then you got to bring in the women, her story. Because me here say this. The wimpy white dude, Bob Dylan, how does it feel? The confident black man, James Brown, I feel good. I knew that I would. Now, just turn it over to the women. Memphis Minnie, I feel like balling the jack. Okay, Clinton, final benediction. If you take melody, press to an extreme, what might it flip into?
I'm taking it literally because the best example I can think of melody pushed to the extreme would be like Jeff Lynne, Electric Light Orchestra, just like violins out the wazoo, just nonstop, right? Lush, right? Memorable, catchy at multiple levels, right? And then it's something, right? It's there's music, there's especially polyphony like that is so lush and so rich, and you want to climb into it through your headphones, right? That just for me that flips into something really like womb like or prenatal, where it's like you're crawling into something like your baby, and the only thing there is the rhythm of the heartbeat, and that's all there is, right? And so it's not even melody anymore, right? That's just sort of what
that was good
would be.
No, I like that because it goes back to the womb. That's where we started, right? With John, womb service. And just closing out, that's Frank Zappa was explaining his song, Why Does It Hurt When I Pee? And he said he mixed it with English pomposity. I can't even say the word bombacity. How do you say that word?
You said it right.
You did it.
Bombacity. That's good.
He said he mixed English bombacity with Tico. And I didn't know what Tico. John, can you play Tico on that keyboard for a second?
Oh, I don't know.
That's pretty good. So, in closing, I want to thank you all, and I really think we should make this at least every other month or twice a year or once a year. It was really fun, and I learned a lot. I'll end out with a few little Zappa things. He has this great manifesto. He says music is the best, and it is an amazing universal language, as Corlapan had said, and someone said something about fuel, and Sunross said that music is like rocket fuel. And since Frank said a great little twister, the ocean is the ultimate solution. I turned to Anthony Burgess to close us out. The guy who wrote 8 books on James Joyce, wrote Clockwork Orange, pretty good writer, and a musician. We must now ask some very different questions about the relationship between music and life. So, to me, this has been living, and I really appreciate all your time and energy, gentlemen. Thank you so much. And even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope we can carry on forever and ever. If anyone else has any comments they want to close out with, I'm welcome to hear them too.
It's a pleasure and an honor to meet you guys. Thanks for having me
as
here.
well.
Okay.
Same here.
Thank you all. John, Paul, Ira, Clinton, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.